Everyone, and welcome to Shrink Think, our YouTube channel made for therapists and talking about common errors in the treatment of survivors of narcissistic and psychopathic abuse. I am Sandra Brown. I am the president of the Association for NPD and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment and the director over at the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Chelli Pumphrey.
Hello, Sandra, and everybody that's watching. I am a licensed professional counselor and a board member with Sandra, and I'm also the author of Insight is 2020, and I'm excited to be here and talk to all of you about this very important topic.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about stabilization today. And so within trauma treatment. And so I want to start by reminding our listeners to some statistics that we had given back in maybe the first show that we did about this being a trauma population. But just to keep that fact clear, the PLR population trauma survey indicated that 90% of survivors coming out of pathological relationships have trauma symptoms, and 75% of them go on to have a trauma disorder from either no treatment or the wrong treatment, or from trauma worsening, which often happens, especially when they are exposed to non-trauma informed care practices with bloggers, or even in coaching when they are nowhere ready for coaching. So with those percentages in mind, clearly this is a trauma population. So granted, I was trained, back with the dinosaurs when they roamed the earth. To date myself, I think I've said this before, I was trauma trained in 1990 with Bessel van der Kolk and Judith Herman. So that's
so awesome.
And so long ago, Judith isn't even practicing anymore. And so granted, I'm old school, whatever. But what happened to the stabilization phase of treatment? Like, where did it go? Did I blink and they erase it? Did I not get the memo? One of the things that we did was the Institute did a study called the Finding Competent Care Study, or what we call the FCC. And it was to look at the widespread failed treatment in this genre of counseling with this population. Granted, this is, as we measure in the psychology field, this is a nanosecond old. Old theory was measured by centuries. So, my book came out, and although I've been working in it 30 years, my book didn't come out till 2005. So we're talking about 17 years, granted, a lot of this information did not exist for trauma therapists, to work with. But when we did the FCC study, one of the things that we were looking at is why there was such widespread treatment failure, and what were some of the things that they were doing that was wrong and not doing that they should have been doing. And that survey that particular one was over 300 survivors, and they all talked about the same thing, which was there was no stabilization phase in treatment. And so if we remember, for any of those, I mean, surely all of us have read Judith Herman's classic book, was it Trauma and Recovery or something like that? She delineated 3 phases of treatment, one of which is stabilization. And I don't know what happened to it. Have you seen stabilization anywhere?
It is very concerning. I get a lot of people that come in that had not good trauma therapy, are
They
completely
don't do it.
traumatized just by the therapy itself because it just adds to their trauma symptoms.
Right, and that's one of the things in the FCC study that out of 300, over 300 survivors that took that, and we asked specifically, about the issue of stabilization. First of all, they were never diagnosed with trauma to use stabilization. But for those that were diagnosed, they just went right into the narrative. And so I haven't been out in trauma certification land in a while to know if did we decide that wasn't necessary? Is it being taught? I keep feeling like it's not being taught as a phase in treatment anymore.
Yeah, and I'm like you. I mean, I got a lot of my training back just after the dinosaurs, and
Yeah,
I mean, I still do updated trainings, but they're like building on,
yeah,
that initial phase. And
base.
I think, there are certain trainings that do speak to this, but my concern is a lot of therapists calling themselves trauma therapists are saying that, because I think there's an assumption that because we're therapists, we work with trauma, but to work with trauma and to actually know how to work with trauma are 2 different things. Like, to be experienced and trained appropriately. And this is such
Right.
a great example of not, not recognizing the importance of stabilization before you even, like, that needs to
Ask
happen
for the
that
narrative.
very first session,
And yeah, absolutely. We've talked about this in one of our previous shows. That's why in our to be in our therapist referral network that they have to be trauma certified, not 2 hours of trauma-informed care.
right,
That's not
right.
what we're talking about. Again, 90% of this population has trauma symptoms, and 75% of them will go from symptoms to disorders. And I would say a lot of that is because they're not getting treatment or the right treatment, or they're going to survivors turned experts. So, just in case that old picture, Where's Waldo, that maybe stabilization has gone missing. We're going to talk about what maybe you can talk about in your first point about what the purpose of stabilization is.
Right. Well, it assumes that somebody is destabilized from trauma. And as we've talked about, when you've got 90% of these survivors coming in with trauma, you know, that's not a small number. That's almost everybody you're seeing. And most of them come in because their trauma symptoms are unmanageable. And
Yeah.
so we have to assume that this is kind of it's this underlying foundation, and you don't start without paying attention to this.
Right. And I always use that analogy that um, these statistics and 75% to 90% of these are like what we see in sexual assault.
Mhm.
And there's not a therapist alive that would think that a sexual assault survivor was not traumatized.
Right, right.
But for some reason, in this population, a lot of therapists aren't getting that. I
Yes.
think it's because it's made to sound so simple out there
Mhm.
on the internet. Go, no contact, and break a trauma bond. Poof, you're done, kind of thing, that we miss that this really is. Um, so as you were saying, that it is because that their trauma symptoms are unmanageable, and maybe you talk about why they are
Right.
unmanageable.
Well, and this is because most people don't even know what trauma is. They don't know that things that they're experiencing are symptoms of trauma, and therefore they haven't been, taught to understand it or how to manage it. And I want to just add to this too, there's this extra nuance to it with this particular kind of trauma in a PLR, because we have a lot of atypical trauma symptoms that therapists do not recognize. And so
Uh,
you have the survivor that may not recognize they're experiencing trauma, and then you have a clinician who might think, oh, this person's just stressed because they're having conflict with their partner, and they're not seeing the very different kinds of expression of trauma symptoms in survivors as
right.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the whole issue I think about our training, and what a lot of my research has been as a contribution to this field has been the detection of atypical trauma. And if we don't detect it, we certainly aren't treating it. So,
Right.
and why the workshops have been really necessary, because their trauma often comes looking very, very different. So on those lines, then how does trauma become more manageable?
Well, we start with trauma education and helping them learn different skills that can help them manage it. And it's basically like giving you an education about what's happening in your mind and body when you've experienced trauma, and how to how to learn how to help that so that we can actually start moving into the working
Treatment.
part of therapy, right?
Right,
Like you got to learn how to ride the bike. You got to put the training wheels on the bike
right,
before you let somebody go ride the bike.
right. And we talk about it as like skill building, especially in emotional dysregulation, because that's what trauma is. The dysregulation to the central nervous system, and that survivors, need to be able to manage the emotional dysregulation of their system to even be able to talk about and work with the narrative in deeper treatment. Um, and so, what does skill building do for emotional dysregulation?
Well, it can help them manage the fight, flight, and freeze responses that that memories or triggers of memories get activated in their central nervous system.
Hmm.
So it's our very primal survival responses
Right.
that are constantly flaring when you have trauma that's been unhealed, unresolved. Um, and
Yeah.
your nervous system is just like firing left and right. So we want to teach skills to help them learn how to manage that.
And what does an activated central nervous system produce in symptoms?
Yeah, so the symptoms we most associate with PTSD are what we call hyperarousal and hypoarousal. And hyperarousal is more of the activated, like fight, flight kind of stuff, where there's more of a
Mm-hmm.
kinetic energy in the body, and kind of hypervigilant kind of responses. And then the hypoarousal is more of a freeze reaction and dissociation, more avoidance, where things
Mm-hmm.
are slow and shut down and really disconnected.
And so they come into therapy with these existing conditions and symptoms and haven't yet learned how to manage them. So, what is the primary trigger of activating that in their central nervous system that ends up producing those symptoms of fight, flight, freeze?
Well, essentially, it's anything that reminds them of their trauma. And what I want to clarify here is that we have implicit and explicit memories. So, an explicit memory is like, I clearly remember this, or I go back and I think of this time that my partner and I had a fight over the dishes in the sink. And it's a conscious, clear thing that we're getting activated about. But then there are implicit memories, or even back in early childhood, pre-verbal memories where we don't have a conscious or
It's a
conceptual
feeling
idea of it.
state.
It's totally in the body.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's a
And
feeling
our
state. Yeah,
body can remember those things. You could walk in the room and it's cold, and all of a sudden you're in a fight flight response and you have no idea what triggered it, but
right,
you don't remember that it was cold the day that your partner beat you or something, and
right,
your body sure remembers that.
right. So that would include people, places, events, sights, smells, sounds, and the memories of those. So in therapy, if we ask them about the memories of these events, the central nervous system is going to have a fight, flight, freeze reaction if they haven't been taught the skills to not have it activated. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So I wonder why this is the predominant thing that happens in the first session for almost all PLR survivors. And we're going to role play for you what over 300 survivors said happens in their first and subsequent sessions. All right, what brings you into therapy?
Well, I'm married to a narcissist, and I read about it on the internet, and I definitely know he is one.
And what has he done that makes you think that?
Well, he beat me and he slit my face with a knife. It's so hard to even talk about. He locked me in a closet afterwards, and I was bleeding all over the closet.
I'm so sorry. How many times has he physically harmed you?
There was a time he choked me and collapsed my airway, and then he gave me a black eye, and uh,
Did you make a police report?
you mean after he raped me?
So there were several sexual assaults.
I don't think I can do this canceling. I can't do this.
Take a deep breath and let's start at the beginning and tell me the first episode and all the episodes after that.
Blech.
So in the FCC study, hundreds of survivors said the role play is what happened in their first and subsequent sessions for months until they quit therapy. And so we expected trauma survivors not to have a trauma reaction. We expected that their central nervous systems to be just fine, even though they hadn't had 5 minutes training about their window of tolerance or skills to manage their trauma chemical bomb that was going to explode.
Yeah, that happens whether they're in professional counseling or coaching. I mean, they're telling their story without the skills to manage the higher activation of their symptoms.
Which is what ends up causing trauma worsening. And We did a show on that earlier about this trauma population. So that's the wrong way to do it. What should be happening?
Well, therapists see and feel the urgency of the survivor's need to tell the story and allow them to lead the session without the ability to regulate their nervous system. And it's the primary reason for this trauma worsening. And really, what needs to happen is that therapists need to be taught what we talk about at our training, which we're going to chat about here in a minute, that uses intensive skill building before working with the actual narrative of what was happening that caused the trauma. It's the only way to prevent dual dysregulation in this population.
Right. And we're going to be having a show on the issue about dual dysregulation. This is not a trauma-only population. That is bad enough, having trauma. But they have another hyperarousal aspect that can kick in. And we're going to be talking about the problems and the extra needed focus in our understanding of trauma for people who have two forms of dysregulation. But again, back in the day, I don't know what's happening out there now, but back in the day, we had a very formalized stage of treatment for stabilization. We got their narrative from the intake, and we did not plop their butt in the chair and say, tell me what happened, and then ask more leading questions that's going to lead into more disclosure. We started with skill building and trauma education and teaching them, emotional regulation skills, and then worked into using those emotional regulation skills as they attempt to tell the narrative, so that as, what's his name? Dan, window of tolerance guy.
Dan Siegel?
Yeah. So that they are able to stay in their window of tolerance. What ended up happening in that role play we just did is that you came out of your window of tolerance and you wanted to leave counseling. And that's what happened to over 300 survivors. They were not kept, they couldn't be kept in their window of tolerance because they had no skills to do that. And so they were so overwhelmed with counseling that they quit.
Yeah.
And that we need, in my opinion, sometimes old school's best, that especially in this hair trigger, dual dysregulated population, that these are not the candidates to plop in the chair and say, tell me your story. Not in coaching, not in counseling, that we have to remember, the principles of stabilization and why a trauma population needs it.
Right. And I don't want to go too far into this because this is just a whole other topic, but you know, what what survivors do is when they're experiencing cognitive dissonance, which is one of the main trauma symptoms that we talked about in another video, or you'll learn in the training, but they want to tell the story. There's an urgency to tell their stories too. So I often have to set a boundary with clients coming in because the temptation as a therapist, if you're not aware of this issue, is to just let them tell the
Let them
story.
go.
Right. And then every session can be a retelling and a retriggering of the trauma. And so it's really important to know that that is a thing here. And this stabilization phase is so
Yes,
crucial before you get
right.
into that.
And they will absolutely want to tell their story. They've been out, with survivors turned experts, telling their story over and over again, on social media, telling it, in coaching, telling it, in all it's done, for someone who's dually dysregulated is to blow up their hyperarousal, and then they end up dissociating using hypoarousal to manage their hyperarousal and their cognitive dissonance. And so we have then added to their trauma symptoms. And if you are unfamiliar with stabilization, or wherever you got your trauma training, didn't include that in our core competency training workshops over at survivortreatment.com. We cover stabilization and teach you how to use what we call a structured session approach to really manage these hair trigger dually dysregulated survivors. So thank you for joining us today. Hope you'll go by survivortreatment.com, and we'll be back again with another common treatment area.